Snail, Peter Williams. Definitions and etymology. Snail, one of a group of terrestrial or aquatic mollusks belonging to the class Gastropoda, typically having a spirally coiled shell, a broad retractile foot, and a distinctive head. Sometimes the term snail is applied exclusively to the land animal. Here, I have chosen the wider definition to include those marine and freshwater members of the group. The word snail derives from Old English snaggle, where snag or sneg means to crawl. The word is a diminutive form of Old English snaka, from which the word snake also derives, meaning literally a creeping thing. Slug, a land snail in which the shell is absent or rudimentary. Sea slugs also exist. Mollusks, soft-bodied creatures comprising chitons, amphinuera, snails and slugs, gastropoda, toothed shells, scaphopoda, oysters and mussels, lamellibranches, as well as octopuses and squids, cephalopoda, sometimes spelled the American way, mollusks. Conchologist, a student and often a collector of shells. Malacologist, a student of molluscan anatomy and hence the soft parts of the animal, from the Greek malakos, meaning soft. 1. Our relationship with the snail. So attached was the author Patricia Highsmith to snails that they became her constant traveling companions. Secreted in a large handbag, or in the case of travel abroad, carefully positioned under each breast, they provided her with comfort and companionship in what she perceived to be a hostile world. There was an unusual relationship, one normally reserved for a dog or a cat. For most human beings, just a mention of the word snail brings out a negative response. Certainly not warmth or affection or a desire to share living space. It seems as though the relationship we have with this animal has been influenced by the harm it has inflicted over the years on the cabbage crops, strawberries, and garden seedlings. Britain is a nation of gardeners and doesn't take kindly to animals that threaten that pastime. Try looking at the shelves of any bookshop for a volume on snails that is complimentary to them, and you will be disappointed. The language is often heated and full of military metaphors. Understand the enemy as a first step to banishment, says one, while another urges us to stop them in their tracks with a barrier or a trap. The Royal Horticultural Society makes slugs and snails the #1 pest. Andrew Holgate, writing for the Sunday Times in a piece appropriately entitled Hostas at Dawn, Showdown in the Garden, singles them out as the worst offenders in the garden and amongst the most unpleasant of the creatures to be found there. America is similarly unimpressed by slugs and snails. There they have been described as fun to hate, easy to kill, but maddeningly difficult to control. While the majority of gardeners would agree with these sentiments, Steve Jones, an acknowledged snail expert, is of the opinion that snails aren't just beautiful creatures that deserve our respect, but efficient machines capable of turning grass into flesh. He points out that while it takes at least 5 pounds of high-quality grain to make a ground of beef, snails are known to be twice as efficient on a much feebler diet. Instead of being our enemies, they should be our servant, providing food for hungry mouths. For my own part, the relationship with the snail started when I was young, staying at my aunt's house perched precariously on a Welsh hillside. I remember them emerging as if by magic on the stone steps leading down to the river after a shower of rain. To this day I associate the smell of wet concrete and coal dust with Helix aspelsa, the common garden snail. Only later did I realize that a majority of land snails were much smaller and less conspicuous than these well-fed creatures. My curiosity quickly extended to sea snails when, like Eustace in L.P. Hartley's Shrimp and the Anemone, I would stare for hours into rock pools and become drawn to the secret world of winkles, limpets, and topshells. The discovery of snails in ponds and streams advanced the relationship one step further and made me realize what a diverse group of animals I was witnessing. Though I was never tempted to keep snails as pets, as I believe Beatrix Potter did, and certainly never achieved the affinity for them that Patricia Highsmith enjoyed, I was surprised to read the depictions of snails as rather sinister, far from comforting creatures in two of Highsmith's short stories. In the first, The Snail Watcher, snails are responsible for the macabre death of the man who bred them. Locked in his laboratory, layers deep in snails, he finds himself unexpectedly overwhelmed. Mr. Nobbart tried to brush the snails off his arms, but for every 100 he dislodged, 400 seemed to slide upon him and fasten to him again, as if they deliberately sought him out as the only comparatively snail-free surface in the room. There were snails crawling over his eyes. He swallowed one. Choking, he widened his mouth for air and felt a snail crawl over his lips onto his tongue. He was in hell. He could feel them gliding over his legs like a glutinous river, pinning his legs to the floor. In a second, the quest for Blanc Claveringe, Avery Clavering, a professor of zoology, encounters a giant snail on the uninhabited island of Kua. As the two draw near to one another, the snail lifts his head in a menacing way, and the professor gets more than he bargains for. The professor angrily flung handfuls of water at the snail's face. The snail only lifted its head higher out of the professor's range. Its form was slender now, and it had, oddly, the grace of a horned gazelle, of some animal of the deer family. The snail lowered its snout, and the professor trudged away, but not quickly enough. The snail came down on his shoulder, and the suctorial mouth clamped. He realized as the thousands of pairs of teeth began to gnaw at his back that his fate was both to drown and to be chewed to death. The idea of a snail as a human aggressor sounds like revenge for all those hostile acts committed by man on the animal. Maybe it was Highsmith's way of redressing the balance. There is no doubt that inflating the size of a snail or imagining overwhelming numbers of the creatures can make you shudder, but transpose the snail to a watery environment and the threat recedes. Snails that live in water, despite being sometimes larger than those that live on land, are undoubtedly far less threatening. I can find only one reference to a murderous sea snail on film in The Monster That Challenged the World, 1957, and the reviews suggest it was rather unconvincing. Far from being threatening, sea snails such as whelks and winkles have provided man with welcome food for eons. Their shells epitomize the sea, and many are collected for their sheer beauty. As Peter Dance, a world authority on shells and shell collecting, points out, the spirally twisted shell of the sea snail has more appeal to the collector than that of the hinged bivalve shell. It might be thought that snails found on land and in fresh water would have less appeal, but even as far back as the 17th century, many of their shells were thought desirable. The appeal of land snails as food was and is more variable, much of it culturally determined. Mary Fisher, the food writer, once described herself as being dizzy for days after eating enough land snails in Dijon to make her feel she had old rubber boiled in garlic inside her. The experience didn't put her off eating them again, however. I like snails, she quipped defensively. After all, most people like snails. She was, I suspect, reflecting a French gastronomic view of land snails, not one shared by the inhabitants of Great Britain. When it comes to slugs, Mary Fisher's attitude proved quite different. I have tried to be callous about slugs. I have tried to picture the beauty of their primeval movements before a fast camera, and I have forced myself to read in the Encyclopedia Britannica the harmless ingredients of their oozy bodies. Nothing helps. I have a horror deep in my marrow of everything about them. Slugs are awful. Slugs are things from the edges of insanity. In zoological terms, slugs are merely snails that have lost their shells. a process that has occurred on several occasions in the course of evolution. While numerous recipes exist for snails, virtually none exists for slugs. Most people show an aversion to picking up a slug. Few are averse to picking up a snail. The distinction between the two may be a narrow one, but the human response is fundamentally different. The reason, I believe, lies in the distinction we make between snail body and snail shell. The safe, non-aversive bit is undeniably the shell, particularly if empty or fragmented. The unsafe, potentially revolting bit is the soft body, revealed in its fullest extent in the slug. Though the shell is the product of the body, secreted by its covering or mantle, the two are usually seen as being unconnected, as though a living animal occupies an otherwise empty shell. As one writer put it, "It comes as a shock to many people that an animal is involved at all. Their surprise always comes as a shock to me." These are the molded by waves theorists who believe that shells are actually mineral deposit or the calcified remains of vegetation. They repeat "animal" numbly after me, obviously visualizing something with 4 legs and a tail, totally lost. It is hard for some people to think of a snail as an animal, but then it is hard for some people to classify themselves in that category. We are conditioned to think of the snail as an animal that uses its shell solely for protection, in much the same way that a hermit crab uses an empty mollusk shell as a refuge. It becomes as a surprise that as the body of the animal grows in the shell enlarges as well. Rather than being shed like a snake's skin when it gets too small, the snail shell is simply added to, preserving its shape. Some of the earliest drawings of snails, such as those from Hortus Sanitatis in the 16th century, show the occupant's head peeping out from a protective tube as though it has just found a shelter. It is with reference to the shell alone that early classifications of snails were based, and as if to emphasize this distinction between the hard and soft parts, students of snails are designated either conchologists, those who are primarily interested in the shell, or malacologists, whose main interest is in the soft body. When considering our relationship with the snail, it seems that there is an unconscious need to keep the two bits apart rather than countenance one integrated creature. Following this line of thought, I wish to consider man's relationship with the snail's shells, then with its body and the products of that body, before re-examining the relationship with the animal as a whole.